Hi, I'm Stas Margaronis, reporter for the American Journal of Transportation, and we're speaking today with John McCown, who is the publisher of the McCown Report, and it is based on the volume at the 10 largest ports in the United States that generate 86% of the container volumes for the nation, and they're located on the West Coast, East Coast, and Gulf Coast ports. John McGowan, good morning, sir. Or good morning from California, anyway. Good afternoon on the
Uh,
East Coast.
Good afternoon to me, and good morning to you, Stas. Great to be here.
Thank you. John, your most recent report, you say that July figures came in at major ports at 3.2% up from a year ago. News reports today say U.S. imports and exports both were up in July. Some analysts, including some from the Trump administration, are saying that this says that the tariffs are not having such a negative impact, but you have been arguing that the other shoe has yet to drop. John, where are we as of your July report?
Well, yes, I disagree with that characterization. July had a modest increase of 3%, which I view as totally temporary. If you look at June and May before that, we were looking at a 9% reduction in June. I think May was about 6 or 7%. And so July is really nothing more than kind of a front loading to get under the tariffs in August. If you look at the overall figures, we've been in a clear downtrend. If you look at the trailing 3-month average, we've been in a clear downtrend throughout this year. And so I think the last 3 months are down a little bit more than 3%. I expect that to deteriorate significantly. And I felt that the tariffs, when they kick in, will be meaningful. It's worth remembering also there are several lag effects. The tariffs were first announced in April, but those tariffs didn't even the April, if it was put on a ship in Asia in April, it was free. And so those ships wouldn't get to the US until May, and even some cases, maybe even June. So there's a lag effect there. There's another lag effect as the cargo is really taken off. That inflation impact, if you will, only kind of occurs when there's a sale of that. And so that's really more related to the inflation. But I think the count is going to, for the balance of this year, be much more negative than we've seen. And one insight into that, a couple of weeks ago, the National Retail Federation came out with their own overall estimate of inbound volume, showing inbound volume in 2025, they're seeing down 5.6% versus 2024. That number by itself doesn't seem extraordinarily shocking until you realize that if you take into account the year-to-date figures for July and you kind of go into the numbers, that translates into a double-digit decline for the balance of the year, something on the order of 17%. So I think we're going to, as these tariffs kick in, and August was a key period for a whole group of additional tariffs kicking in. And as the supply chains adjust, I think we're going to see some meaningful reductions, much more meaningful reductions in our volume going forward.
John, you and I have talked about this earlier in the year, and at that time, and you've said this consistently, that this downturn is very different from 2008, the financial crisis, and 2020 during the pandemic, that you expect that this is going to be a long slide downwards. Could you explain why you think that is?
Well, the big adjustment that we saw after the financial crisis was really driven by trade financing issues that kind of were quickly solved, and it kind of became very temporary. Here, between the tariffs and the USTR ship fees, it's as if there's a kind of a broad attack on the concept of trade itself. I know the goals that are desired in terms of doing that, but we're looking at some rather meaningful adjustments. When you look at some of the level of tariffs, we've gone from basically a world where it was free trade. I think the weighted average tariff in the world was like 1.5%. To now, the U.S. is, various figures are showing we're at the 20-25% range. And that will have its desired effect of stopping some of that cargo. When something costs 25% more, all of a sudden that changes the equation in terms of what somebody can do. So I think it will have a meaningful impact. The first Trump administration, those tariffs were much more narrow, mostly focused on China and a smaller amount. But even with those, we saw an immediate effect. But as I followed the numbers over time, that dissipated in terms of the impact on the inbound cargo to the U.S. And there were workarounds in terms of Chinese companies finishing up things in Vietnam or Cambodia. But these tariffs are much more massive, and there's really no getting around that they should have a meaningful impact on volume. The way I look at it, it's really kind of on a spectrum when you look at the size of these tariffs. Again, 20-25% is an additional cost. And so that is going to knock some of the volume off. And as that volume is reduced, as I kind of highlight in my reports, if it was, say, a 25% reduction, you're looking at a commerce effect of something on the order of $125 billion a month. That sort of reduction in commercial activity can't help but have in my view, kind of a slowing impact on the economy. The volume that will continue to move in, however, will move in with that additional 20% or 25%, which ultimately is always going to be paid by the consumer, and that's going to have an inflation impact. So it's really kind of one or the other. For the folks that are suggesting that there's not going to be much of an impact, and again, they're looking at the wrong data to somehow pick just July and say, well, July is up, so tariffs might not be having an effect, is ignoring the longer term data. I've seen some spokespeople look at year to date. Again, that's kind of ignoring the more recent data. But if one were to hypothetically say, well, they're not going to have any effect, then the adverse effect on the economy is going to be much more skewed towards the inflation side. It's going to be one or the other. It's just hard, and again, this is the initial impact is going to be a combination of reduced commercial activity related to the volume and increased inflation. So I don't know exactly where it's going to be on that spectrum. I make the obvious point, that there really is no comfortable place to be on that spectrum, because those are all the immediate effects. The longer term goals in terms of bringing back jobs, those are down the road. And how one can precisely measure those is a whole different question. But the immediate impact, unfortunately, I see as being adverse, both in a economic growth standpoint and an inflation standpoint.
Let me ask you. You mentioned $125 billion. What is that a monthly loss to the economy?
That is, and my latest report specifically referred to if we hypothetically had a 25% reduction in volume versus where it is, and using kind of a figure that has been some academics put together in terms of the average value of a TEU of containers. So it's just meant to kind of underscore that you're dealing with a pretty meaningful part of the economy. And you can't have, with reduced volume, there's going to be reduced work by dock workers. There's going to be reduced work by truck drivers. Everybody that's involved in that supply chain of moving those goods, are going to be negatively impacted. And so that has in my view, that has a commercial effect in terms of, slowing down the economy.
Okay,
Yes.
so John, let's talk about what are your projections for the rest of 2025? What do you see happening for the rest of the year?
Well, I think it's going to be negative, by some double-digit amount. The numbers, looking at my numbers year to date through July and superimposing the Retail Federation estimate, I think it's about a 17.5% reduction for the rest of the year. I think it will be meaningful. I certainly think it'll be over 10%. And it doesn't magically end at the end of the year. We're going to go into 2026 with meaningful reductions versus the year earlier period. And I think that many economists have pointed to something like tariffs as being a one-time adjustment. And in theory, that is the case if everybody was, if the tariffs were all put in place, being a one-time adjustment. With the way this is being kind of rolled out, though, where there's kind of a series of tariffs and different issues and different tariffs coming into place, and even the USTR, there's perhaps a constant growth in that, which would mean that there'd be more of a dynamic or growth month to month and more of a negative trend line.
John, talk to me about exports. What are you seeing on the export side for 2025?
Well, exports have been weak also, and the reality is that there will be countervailing tariffs. One of the ironies, or one of the that I observed in the tariffs from the first Trump administration, as I indicated earlier, after about a year, it was hard to really see any real impact of those tariffs on the inbound cargo, but there was a clear effect on the outbound, and so that really, at least in the first administration, my observation, again, just looking at the container box count, those tariffs didn't do much for inbound boxes, but they hurt outbound boxes. That's exactly the opposite of what, people that believe in tariffs, that's exactly the opposite of their goal,
Right.
because those exports are more directly related to jobs in America. There's no reason to think that we won't experience at least as much, sadly, perhaps even more impact on the export side, with these tariffs. And the same thing with the USTR fees. I mean, that applies to both imports and exports, or ships. Those ships move both outbound and inbound boxes.
John, do you have a projection of what the impact could be for exports this year?
I don't. I mostly focus in the container space. The economics are driven by your inbound loads.
Yeah.
In container shipping, Terminal 101 is you're loading as many boxes on a ship as you're taking off. It's just if a lot of those boxes are going to be empty. And so the outbound leg it doesn't really have much of an effect on the economics. That's why the outbound rates are so much lower than the inbound rates.
Of course.
It kind of will fall in place, and I think be at least a similar decline as we'll see on the inbound.
So we've been hearing a lot that there's been a lot of movement out of China and to Southeast Asia. And we thought that would include India, although the president has now fooled us by imposing 50% tariffs on India. and sending Mr. Modi to become good friends with Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping of China. Are we seeing any trends here that we can, I mean, where is this all going to lead? Are we going to be getting things from Southeast Asia? Are we going to be getting, where are we going to be getting things from if China isn't a major source of our trade anymore?
Well, I think China will continue to be a major source no matter what. Perhaps not as much as it was in the past, but China and through kind of things that are related to it, they're for the most part, I understand, and I guess I hope that products that previously moved in China that are now moving from, say, Vietnam and Cambodia, are actually, finished work, value added. It's not just a transshipment. That's kind of illegal. But China will continue to be a meaningful part. It's impossible really not to see, and that's my observation when the first tariffs came in. At least the products that were hit with about as I recall, 15% tariff. The reason there was a pause initially that there were people, manufacturers or importers in the U.S. that said, hey, on that product, this changes the dynamics. Let me see if that changes the equation of where I can source it. And my conclusion, again, from looking at the macro data, was that they decided after looking into it that there was no ready alternative that gave them both the combination of price and quantity. China can produce significant quantities of something. And if you're a major importer, that's kind of a key observation. So I think that people will go through the same process. Now we're dealing with a much wider array of products with much higher tariffs. And so that can change it, but it doesn't mean that China is not going to be a meaningful part. What I do think, what the data is showing, and this is really more recent and still needs to be looked into, but I'm able to kind of compare the data of the inbound to the 10 largest U.S. ports, and what that is a percentage of the total inbound into North America. Container Trade Statistics maintains very excellent overall data, and that data shows a rather major increase in the past month or two in terms of the inbound to parts of North America other than the U.S., and that obviously means Canada and Mexico. And so I think that one of the things that sadly is going to happen, and you've seen announcements in terms of major expansions of container terminals in Mexico, and I'm sure people are even looking into it in Canada, of seeing that as a moving cargo, not you're not able to get around the tariffs just by moving it in there, but people are, I'm sure, looking into setting up final manufacturing or some element in those countries that qualifies that it's still value added. So those were, and again, that could apply to have a lower overall cost. But one of the things, to go back to your point about India, that you hit the nail on the head, Stas, that one of the real problems here is that nobody seems to be having a holistic view of what's going on. It's kind of ad hoc decisions of things and ad hoc decisions that, people, when they look into them, say, wow, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. And there are multiple examples that seem to come up every day and every week of unintended consequences where somebody is literally can kind of make a case that this tariff is leading to somebody moving operations or thinking about moving operations offshore, because they're again, what also I don't think is understood as much by policymakers in Washington is gone are the days where we're importing a lot of final products. The supply chains have become so complex and so intermingled, and so many manufacturers or product manufacturers that we view as U.S. manufacturers making products here, they rely on key components coming in from overseas, and so that's bringing additional inflation in. So I've noticed, and others that know more about it than I, that there is just really a real lack of kind of a holistic approach on this. And the India example is a classic case in point. For decades, administrations have been trying to get closer to India, kind of as a wedge, and as you said, that would be kind of the natural that we might want to see more products made in India. And of course, lopping a 50% tariff, even allegedly because India is buying Russian oil when China is buying more Russian oil, and India is taking most of that oil and selling it to people in Europe. It doesn't really seem to be well thought out.
Okay.
And that lack of consistency or planning doesn't help anybody.
John, in terms of ports who are winners and losers in 2026, could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing? I'm up in Northern California, and the Port of Oakland is very concerned because 50% of our volume is export, and we have experienced the problems that you have raised with countervailing duties from places like China impacting our pistachios and almonds and other products. When you look at 2026 and you look at the ports that you have looked at, do you see any trends in terms of winners and losers? Are there going to be more of a consolidation? One of the things that we've been concerned about on the West Coast is we could end up being just Los Angeles and Long Beach, and almost everything else getting trucked. And I wonder whether the same impact could happen with, say, Savannah and New York on the East Coast, and maybe less and less going on in the Gulf. But what is your impression?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think it's really hard to kind of tease out meaningful differences within the ports. I mean, this is such a big macro effect of tariffs and the USTR that everybody's going to be broadly impacted, the same way. Some will be more, but I don't think it's hard for me to, I think the ports that do more business with people that are hit with the highest tariffs, there's going to be a marginal effect, but everybody's going to be kind of slammed pretty hard. I think the best window to kind of the future, if you will, I've always thought is still the past. And I think there'll continue to be some macro movements that I see happening and driven by economics. And one of those, quite frankly, is there's going to be a subtle, consistent move, probably something in the order of 50 basis points a year for goods that now go to West Coast ports moving to East Coast ports. And that's simply because they end up being closer to the population areas that they end up in. And all water or more water is always more economical than moving it even intermodally. So that's a subtle effect. I think the ports that have been the biggest winners in a relative sense recently will probably continue to be, and none other than no port has probably shined as much as Houston. Houston has a number of advantages going to it. One, it's closer to the population center. Houston's probably benefited more than anybody in terms of a shift from the West Coast to the East or Gulf Coast. Even though you got that kind of little out of route jingle going up into the Gulf, it's closer to population centers. Houston, I continue to believe that the ports that are managed under what's called a kind of an operating port structure as opposed to a landlord port structure. I can see in the data a little bit more consistent growth, and I think that is simply because the operating port structure really requires much more deep knowledge of the container space, whereas the landlord structure, you're really not in the container terminal business. You're leasing your property to others that are in that. And so, that's been the traditional model, but the fastest growing ports have always really been the ones that have that operating port structure. So I see those occurring. On the flip side, no port has been as disadvantaged by the shift eastward, probably as Seattle Tacoma, because so much of that freight, is kind of Seattle Tacoma is more of a way station to go across large distances, of the U.S. to population centers. And so, again, the cost economics favor more kind of all water. If you look at roughly speaking, we have a little bit more than, almost close to 50% of the cargo in containers breaks over the West Coast. And yet only about 25% of the US population is physically closer to that. I'm not suggesting that it's going to shift to that, but that's kind of a factor that will have that change continuing. And then on top of that, certain parts of the East, particularly the Southeast, have a little bit more dynamic growth that will, and in the
Like
end, the
Savannah.
cargo and containers, yes, Savannah has been exceptional success story over, decades, and they kind of had become the model of others. Savannah was kind of the first to realize. Let's not market to the carriers. They can change on a dime. Let's market to the end customer, the shippers. And so Savannah smartly marketed and got distribution centers for the Home Depot and Walmart and folks like that. And once you have that, the carriers will come. But that strategy is now being followed by other ports. I've written about a concern that I have that we are closer than we might think to reaching capacity limits in our ports, and I think that needs to be addressed with major new expansions, maybe even brand new ports, even rethinking kind of where the containers are stored versus the vessel, because if you look at Stas at pictures of most busy ports today. You have containers stacked 5 and 6 high most of the time, and you're starting to kind of get to capacity limits. You can't. These terminals really aren't designed to stack loaded containers. I think about seven high loaded containers, you can start kind of breaking pavement. So I think we need to look at. We've seen the real downside of a jammed up terminal network. And so I think we need to spend more time seriously kind of looking at the long-term needs for additional container terminal capacity.
John, we're getting to the end of our time here, but I've got a quick question. We talked about the USTR fees and what the impact would be, and you have reported that we're seeing blank sailings starting to get announced by the carriers. What is the impact going forward if we assume that the U.S. trade representative fees on Chinese-built and Chinese-operated vessels goes into effect in October? Are we going to start to see a lot more blank sailings? And what's going to be the impact to the carriers? Which of the carriers are likely to do better and which are going to do worse?
Well, I view the USTR ship fees as really just a blunter form of tariff. And while the second plan they came out with was better than the first, the first really set a really low bar. The USTR ship fees really can't be helped by blanking sailings. They're going to really these fees effectively make a ship that is subject to them, in my view, non-competitive because you're dealing with over $1 million in fees easily per voyage. And so if that ship were to continue doing that, and found customers, even passing along that cost, I guess you could say that that's going to lead to other carriers that don't have that also raising their costs. But the more likely effect is that there's going to be a lot of juggling within the alliances, where the alliances, and I'm speculating here, but I know if I was involved in an alliance, I would try and switch all my China built ships and Chinese carrier ships to alliance's European service and get those ships and put them in to kind of get around. So that's going to require a lot of switching. I think the most immediate effect is going to be a capacity reduction, and most particularly a capacity reduction in your market of Asia, your submarket, Asia to the West Coast. Obviously, the most impacted carrier will be COSCO. COSCO will be kind of double hit, obviously a Chinese carrier, and almost all of their ships are built in China. So there's no way they get around that. Costco is only, I say only, Costco is the fourth largest carrier in the world, but Costco is the largest carrier in terms of Asia to West Coast. And if memory serves, I think their share is something like 16%. So that, unless I'm reading something wrong, if there's no change in that, then that would suggest there's going to a pretty striking increase in cost and rates for everybody. More likely is going to be that capacity is going to be juggled so that it's not hitting, when that goes into effect. And I guess the most immediate effect of that would be a rather sharp reduction in capacity. And where that starts to have the most impact, quite frankly, in the U.S. is on the rate side. If those ships are taken out of the U.S. market, we could find ourselves in a bit of a capacity crunch. And we know what happens when you're short capacity. Rates go up. And so, but what as disruptive as the tariffs are, at least those are a little bit more predictable if you actually know what the tariff is. My fear is that the USTR is going to have a whole bunch of unintended consequences or things that we can't quite see now, because I do think there will be a rather immediate rush to avoid having any of those ships. And I just talked about the COSCO ships. One of their alliance partners is CMA CGM. If I recall right, something in the order of 50% of CMA CGM's ships are built in China. So that kind of creates some real issues in terms of even accomplishing that juggling thing that I'm talking about. One of the things the numbers are showing is that even with the U.S. volume going down, that's being mitigated by some rather meaningful growth in other markets. China's exports for June, while well below what they have been in the past, we're still up about 4%. The Far East exports, rather, mostly China. And so what's happening, Stas, is seemingly is the rest of the world is kind of adapting, finding other markets, and so maybe the initial impact in the USTR might be more of a capacity reduction than people are expecting. Because that capacity reduction will certainly have a rather immediate rate impact. And if you look at
impact on the United States, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. Just on the United States. Well, primarily on the United States. One of the things the data has shown is that it's hard to the Far East to North America trade lane is roughly 25% of worldwide container miles. So what happens in that trade lane will have ripple effects. I mean, it's hard to isolate, but you're right. The brunt of the brunt of the adverse consequences on tariffs and USTR will fall on the U.S.
Okay. John, we are run out of time here. You have provided us with an excellent analysis and overview. And it is an analysis which I'm afraid is going to go through some other rises and falls during the course of the year. But I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time with us. I think that we can see that ports in the United States are going to be facing some very serious volume uncertainties going into 2026. We don't completely understand what those are. We have seen some trend lines in 2025. As you pointed out, there was a lot of front loading in the first part of the year. So things look much better than they are going to be looking in the latter part of the year. And going into 2026, that's going to leave some real challenges for some of our ports that are less able to withstand the ups and downs than others. You've characterized Savannah as being a very forward-looking port, Houston as being strategically centered. The ports of LA and Long Beach continue to benefit from their proximity to Asia, but other ports are going to be in a very different place, and we still don't understand the impact all of this is going to have on our exporters going long term. COSCO, China Ocean Shipping Company, they're going to experience some problems in the US, but as you pointed out, the Chinese are now finding export markets in other parts of the world. And one of the uncomfortable conclusions from all of this is that one of the unintended consequences of the Trump tariffs is to make the United States less relevant to the world trade market than it was prior to the president showing up and putting in these tariffs. And that's
excellent point. Yeah,
not very good for us. So with that,
agreed.
I want to thank you again, John McCown, publisher of the McCown Report. Everybody's following him. I can say I knew him before he became famous, but he seems to be becoming more and more famous. John, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Stas.
Okay, that's all for me, Stas Margaronis. I'm the ports reporter for the American Journal of Transportation. Thank you all very much.